ever just stop and think about how much has changed in the last few thousand years. Like, seriously. Agriculture, cities, the internet, it's mind-blowing.
It really is.
It's a completely different world. And what if all that rapid change, that crazy pace, it wasn't just our culture?
Right.
What if it went deeper?
Yeah.
What if our genes, our DNA, what if that was evolving at, like, warp speed, too?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it's something that has fascinated scientists for a long time. You know, when they reviewed this book, one reviewer was so into it, he said he read it in a single marathon session.
Mm-hmm.
And another expert said, the authors want us to really fast forward our thinking about human evolution.
Wow, a marathon session. That's intense.
Right. So you can tell right away it's going to be a good one. And what's really wild is that it kind of goes against what a lot of folks thought for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Like for decades, the idea was that, yeah, humans evolved, but our biology, our genetics, it pretty much stopped changing tens of thousands of years ago.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that. Like we hit a plateau or something?
Exactly. That's what people like Stephen Jay Gould and Ernst Mayr argued, basically. Since then, it's been all about culture building on top of this, fixed genetic base.
Okay, so this book is coming in and shaking things up. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
What's it called again?
It's The 10,000-Year Explosion. How Civilization Accelerated Human Evolution.
Okay, The 10,000-Year Explosion. Got it.
And it's by Gregory Cochran and Henry Harpending.
Cochran and Harpending.
And these guys come from anthropology and genetics, so they know their stuff.
They've looked at all the data, and they're basically saying, wait, hold up, not so fast.
Exactly.
So for our deep dive today, you brought some excerpts from that book, right?
Yes, I did. I brought some excerpts from that book and some related research as well.
Awesome. So what's the mission today? What are we trying to unpack for the listener?
Well, we're going to really dive deep into their main argument, which is that human evolution hasn't stopped. Not at all. It's actually been speeding up.
Speeding up? Like how much faster?
Like 100 times faster in the last 10,000 years than before.
Seriously? 100 times faster?
Yeah. To give you an idea of just how crazy that is, they described it as being like trees growing noticeably as you watch.
Wow. That is a wild thought.
It is. It really challenges the way we traditionally think about evolution.
It does. So how do they back that up? What's their evidence?
Well, Cochran and Harpending, they point to a lot of evidence of natural selection happening really recently and happening really strongly in humans.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first things they talk about is this idea of gene replacement.
Gene replacement, okay.
So it's not just that new variations in our genes, like new alleles, are popping up.
Alleles, those are like different versions of a gene, right?
Yeah, exactly. So these new alleles aren't just showing up. They're actually becoming way more common in some populations, especially in Eurasians. And sometimes they're even completely replacing the old versions of those genes.
Oh.
And here's the key thing. The genes that are being favored, they're often different from one group to another. Yeah. So Cochran and Harpending, they argue that the obvious differences we see between, like, different ethnic groups, those are just the tip of the iceberg.
So there's a lot more going on beneath the surface, genetically speaking.
Exactly. It's not just about things we can see easily, like skin color or height. There's a lot happening on a deeper genetic level.
Yeah.
And to study this, they talk about this thing called the HapMap Project.
Okay, the HapMap Project, I've heard of that, but remind me what that was all about.
So the HapMap Project was this huge international effort to map out all the common patterns of genetic variation in humans. They looked at 4 populations to start: Nigerians, European Americans, and people from Tokyo and Beijing.
And what did that, reveal about this whole idea of accelerated evolution?
Well, it gave scientists this incredible look at all the subtle differences in our DNA. And the most exciting parts are the types of changes they saw.
What kind of changes?
Well, it wasn't just about completely new beneficial alleles showing up and spreading, though that was part of it. They also found existing alleles, ones that were already around, becoming more common.
Oh, so alleles that were maybe just hanging out in the background suddenly becoming more important?
Exactly. It's like they became more advantageous in the new environments we were creating. And then there's this other thing where genes are basically being switched on or off in specific groups.
Genes being turned on or off. That sounds kind of sci-fi.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's totally real. They give the example of the Duffy mutation, which is found in parts of Africa where malaria is a big problem.
Right, malaria.
This mutation, it stops a certain receptor on red blood cells from being expressed.
And that helps protect against malaria.
Exactly. It blocks one type of malaria parasite from getting into those cells, But what's really cool is that it only affects that specific receptor. The gene still functions normally everywhere else in the body.
So it's like a targeted defense mechanism.
Yeah, precisely. And then you have cases where the volume of a gene is turned up, so to speak. They talk about the amylase gene, which helps us digest starch.
Amylase starch, okay.
Some populations have multiple copies of this gene, and that means they can break down starchy foods more efficiently.
So if a group traditionally ate a lot of starchy foods, having more copies of that gene would be a huge advantage, right?
Exactly. And it shows how these subtle genetic tweaks can have a massive impact on our biology and how we interact with our environment. It's like a small change with a big payoff. And speaking of small changes, they have this really cool example about dwarfism and how it can be caused by a change in just a single letter of our DNA.
Wow, just one letter. That's crazy to think about.
Right. It really highlights how even tiny genetic differences can have huge effects on our traits. And this ties into how they challenged Lewontin's famous argument.
Lewontin, yeah, he was a big name in genetics. What was his argument again?
Well, Lewontin, he argued that most genetic variation is within populations, not between them.
Okay, within versus between. Got it.
So he was saying that the genetic differences between, say, different ethnic groups are actually pretty small compared to the variation you'd find within any single group.
Interesting. So like two people from the same group could be more genetically different from each other than either one is from someone from a completely different group.
Exactly. And for a long time, that was the dominant view. But Cochran and Harpending, they come in and say, wait a minute, if that's true, then how do we explain all the obvious differences we see between populations?
Right, like those physical differences we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. They argue that those differences, the things we actually see, they must have evolved relatively quickly due to the strong advantages that those underlying alleles, those different gene versions, provided.
So if those traits popped up quickly in different populations, then the genetic changes behind them must have given a serious leg up in terms of survival and having kids.
Exactly. And modern genomics research is starting to back this up. We're seeing that genes for things like light skin color, there's a gene called SLC24A5.
Okay, SLC24A5.
Blue eyes, that's the HERC2 gene.
HERC.
And lactose tolerance, that's the LCT gene.
LCT.
And even something as seemingly insignificant as dry earwax, that's the ABCC11 gene.
Dry earwax? Seriously?
Yeah, all of these have shown signs of strong recent selection. We're not talking about huge advantages here. Even a small edge, like a few % better chance of survival or having kids, can be enough to drive these changes over time.
Wow, that's fascinating. And it makes me think about their example of Native Americans and Northern Asians. They suggest those groups might have diverged, like split off from each other, only around 15,000 years ago.
Right, and that's super recent in evolutionary terms.
It is. It's like a blink of an eye. It makes you think whatever selective pressures were at play, they must have been super intense to drive those changes so quickly.
Right, and if you think about it, this brings us to what really caused this acceleration in human evolution.
What was it?
Well, according to Cochran and Harpending, one of the biggest, most transformative events was the development of agriculture.
Agriculture. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It changed everything, didn't it?
They call it the big change.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to argue with that. They point out that agriculture came about way later than when humans first left Africa.
Right.
And it totally reshaped the playing field in terms of what kinds of pressures we faced.
So how did agriculture lead to this acceleration in evolution?
Well, the most immediate impact was this huge boom in population size.
Oh, yeah. People started living closer together, forming communities.
Exactly. And this meant there was a much bigger pool for new mutations to happen and for beneficial ones to spread more quickly.
Makes sense. More people, more mixing, more chances for those helpful genes to get around.
Precisely. It's a stark contrast to those small, scattered hunter-gatherer groups from before, where things would have moved much slower.
And then there's the whole change in diet, right?
Oh, yeah. That was huge. When we switched to agriculture, our ancestors went from eating a pretty diverse diet, lots of wild plants and animals, to relying on just a handful of crops.
Yeah. So our bodies had to adapt to that.
Exactly. And that led to all sorts of interesting genetic changes. The classic example is lactose tolerance.
Right, being able to digest milk as adults.
Exactly. And mutations in the LCT gene that allowed for that, they spread like wildfire in some populations.
Like in Europe, right, and some parts of Africa.
Exactly. Those groups really relied on dairy, so being able to digest milk was a huge advantage. Cochran and Harpending, they even call those groups mampires, mutants living off the milk of another species.
Vampires, that's funny.
Right, it's their little joke. But what's really cool is that we have actual archaeological evidence to back this up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. When they looked at ancient skeletons from Europe, the allele for lactase persistence, that's the ability to digest lactose, it was completely absent in those skeletons just a few thousand years ago.
Wow, so it really was a recent change.
Yeah, it was. And it shows how powerful those dietary pressures can be. And lactose tolerance is just one example. We also see genetic changes that affect how our bodies handle vitamins.
Okay, vitamins.
And the evolution of light skin in Europe and Northern Asia, that's thought to be partly an adaptation to less sunlight and a diet based more on cereals.
So we could still produce enough vitamin D, right?
Exactly. And there's evidence of new versions of genes popping up that are involved in regulating insulin.
Insulin, that's the hormone that controls blood sugar.
Right. And these new gene versions, they might offer protection against diabetes, which can be a problem when you're eating a lot of carbs.
Fascinating. So these cultural shifts, like switching to agriculture, they have these direct, powerful effects on our genes.
Exactly. It shows how intertwined culture and genes really are.
And it wasn't just diet that changed, right? There were other consequences of agriculture. Like you said, the population boom.
Right. And that led to a whole new world of infectious diseases.
Oh, yeah, because with more people living close together, it's easier for diseases to spread.
Exactly. A lot of infectious diseases need a certain population size and density to really take hold and keep spreading. Like measles, for example. It needs a large, concentrated group of people to constantly find new, susceptible individuals to infect.
So you're saying that before agriculture, before we had these big settlements, diseases like measles might not have even been able to exist.
That's exactly what Cochran and Harpending argue. There simply weren't enough people living close enough together to sustain them.
Huh. That's a mind-blowing thought.
Right. Chickenpox is an interesting one because it can survive in smaller, more spread out populations. But overall, agriculture created this perfect storm for diseases.
Yeah.
Existing diseases became more serious and new ones popped up. Sometimes they were mutations of older, milder diseases, and sometimes they came from the animals we domesticated.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And then later on, as trade and travel increased, we started sharing regional diseases with each other, which sometimes had devastating consequences.
Right, like when Europeans brought diseases to the Americas.
Exactly.
And that had a huge impact on the native populations.
It did. So you have all these local environments and diseases driving genetic changes. But then there's the question of how these beneficial alleles, these advantageous versions of genes, how do they spread more widely?
Yeah, how do they get around?
Intermarriage between groups, that's one way.
Right. But that seems like it would be pretty slow, especially over long distances.
Exactly. It's just not fast enough to explain how some of these beneficial alleles became so widespread in just a few thousand years. And that's where the idea of gene flow comes in.
Gene flow.
Gene flow is basically the movement of genes between populations.
And that can happen much faster than just waiting for people to slowly intermarry over generations.
Exactly. Cochran and Harpending give some fascinating historical examples of how this gene flow happened. Often it's tied to things like trade routes, conquests, and migrations.
Okay, so like people moving around for different reasons and taking their genes with them?
Exactly. Think about those early trade networks, like the connections between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization thousands of years ago. They were trading goods, sure, but they were also probably exchanging genes.
So even though those groups were far apart geographically, their genes were finding ways to mix.
Right. And that could be super important if they were facing similar environmental pressures.
So like if they both needed to adapt to similar climates or diseases.
Exactly. And then you have those massive movements of people that came with empires and conquests, like Alexander the Great. His empire led to Greek settlements all over the Middle East, and even today we can see traces of that gene flow in the DNA of those populations.
Wow. So ancient history is written in our genes.
It really is. And the Mongol conquests under Genghis Khan, that's another dramatic example, they spread certain Y chromosomes across vast territories.
And those genetic traces are still visible today?
In many cases, yes. And even smaller events, like when the Assyrian Empire forcibly relocated millions of people, that definitely shuffled the gene pool in the Fertile Crescent.
So all these historical events, big and small, they were mixing up human genes in ways we might not even realize.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating for you is that even a little bit of contact between groups, like just a few individuals moving between populations, can be enough to introduce a beneficial allele.
Oh, wow. So it doesn't take much.
Nope. And if that allele provides a significant advantage, it can become surprisingly common over time. Like Cochran and Harpending, they talk about the Vandals, who were a Germanic people that moved across Europe and into North Africa.
The Vandals.
Yep. They think the Vandals might have played a role in spreading the allele for blue eyes, which is linked to the OCA2 and HERC2 genes.
Okay, OCA2, HERC2, got it.
The blue eye allele is actually pretty recent, only a few thousand years old, and it's most common in Northern Europe. So those kinds of historical migrations could have been really important for spreading it around.
So we've got local environments and diseases shaping our genes. We've got gene flow mixing things up. And then there's this whole other idea that really caught my attention.
What's that?
The idea that groups with certain biological advantages might have an edge during expansions and conflicts. It makes sense, right? If you've got a beneficial mutation, you're going to be better off than a group that's relying on cultural innovations that can be copied or learned.
Exactly. It's like the difference between learning a new skill and having a built-in advantage. And a really powerful example of this is the impact of European diseases on Native American populations.
Oh, yeah. That's a tragic example.
It is. But it illustrates the point perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Those populations had no prior exposure to diseases like smallpox. And as a result, they hadn't evolved any resistance. And that played a huge role in the European conquest of the Americas.
So a biological disadvantage can have major historical consequences.
Absolutely. And then you have the flip side, where Europeans struggled to penetrate tropical Africa because of diseases like malaria. It wasn't until they developed quinine as a treatment that they could really gain a foothold.
So different environments, different diseases, different selective pressures.
Exactly. And another example is the expansion of Indo-European languages. There's a theory that the lactase persistence mutation, that ability to digest milk, might have given those groups a real advantage.
Because they could rely on a pastoral economy with cows and milk and all that?
Exactly. It gave them a more mobile and nutritious food source, and potentially even contributed to a more warlike culture.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's this one case study that Cochran and Harpending dive into that I found super interesting.
Which one's that?
The Ashkenazi Jews. They use this group as like a really compelling example of recent, strong natural selection.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating one. What really stands out in their analysis is the idea that Ashkenazi Jews show signs of strong selection for intelligence during their time in Northern Europe.
And they point to the fact that they're overrepresented in fields that really require brain power.
Exactly. Things like science, math, chess, business, you name it. They're looking at objective measures like Nobel Prizes and Turing Awards to support this idea.
And they link this back to the unique historical and social situation of Ashkenazi Jews in Northern Europe.
Right. They were often barred from owning land or farming, so they ended up in more urban, cognitively demanding jobs like finance, trade, estate management.
So those jobs required a lot of thinking and problem solving.
Exactly. And because they weren't allowed to marry outside their community, they remained genetically distinct. And rabbinical Judaism, that provided a stable cultural framework for these selective pressures to act over many generations.
So all these factors combine to create a situation where intelligence was really favored.
Exactly. The argument is that people with higher IQs were more likely to succeed in those jobs, which meant greater wealth and more kids. And over time, that could lead to an increase in the frequency of alleles associated with intelligence.
But there's this seeming contradiction, right?
What do you mean?
Well, Ashkenazi Jews also have a higher frequency of certain genetic diseases.
Oh, right. And that seems to go against this whole idea of recent positive selection.
It does, doesn't it?
Well, this is where the idea of heterozygote advantage comes in.
Remind me what that is again?
Heterozygote advantage basically means that having one copy of a disease-causing allele might actually give you a slight advantage, even though having two copies would cause the disease.
So being a carrier can be beneficial.
Exactly. And Cochran and Harpending, they suggest this could be at play with some of the genetic diseases that are more common in Ashkenazi Jews.
Like Tay-Sachs disease, for instance.
Yeah, Tay-Sachs, Gaucher's disease, and BRCA12 gene mutations. They're suggesting that carriers of these alleles might have had some sort of edge in their historical environment, even though it came with the risk of those diseases for their kids.
Interesting. So it's like a trade-off.
Exactly. And there's even research showing a potential link between carrying some of these Ashkenazi disease alleles and having a slightly higher IQ.
Oh, wow, really? So there might be a direct connection between these diseases and cognitive abilities.
That's what some researchers are suggesting. And another important point is that they directly address the idea that this higher frequency of certain diseases is simply due to a genetic bottleneck.
A genetic bottleneck, that's when a population goes through a period with a very small number of individuals, right?
Exactly. And when that happens, just by chance, certain genes can become more common in the population.
So it's like a random sampling effect.
Right. But Cochran and Harpending argue that a bottleneck alone probably can't explain the specific pattern of diseases we see in Ashkenazi Jews. They point out that there's not really strong historical evidence for a severe enough bottleneck to have caused this, and genetic studies don't show a drastic reduction in overall genetic diversity in Ashkenazi Jews compared to other Middle Eastern populations.
So a bottleneck might have played a role, but it's not the whole story.
Exactly. And the fact that these elevated disease frequencies are concentrated in certain metabolic pathways, that suggests that something else is going on, something like heterozygote advantage. And they emphasize that genetic studies consistently show that Ashkenazi Jews are indeed a genetically distinct group, and that individual genetic profiles do align with that group identity.
Okay, so this whole picture of rapid recent evolution, particularly this deep dive into the Ashkenazi Jews, it's full of these surprising, kind of counterintuitive ideas.
Yeah, and they even get into this concept of paternal age and genetic load, which I hadn't really thought about before.
Okay, paternal age and genetic load, what's that all about?
So it basically has to do with the age of the father at the time of conception and how that can affect the number of new mutations that get passed on to his kids.
Okay, the father's age matters.
Yeah. Studies have shown that the number of new mutations from the mother stays pretty consistent throughout her reproductive years. But for the father, it actually increases with age.
Huh. So older fathers pass on more mutations.
Exactly. There's even a formula they mention. Roughly 25 new mutations from a 20-year-old father, plus 2 more for every year over 20.
Okay, so like a 40-year-old father would contribute around 65 mutations.
Yeah, compared to about 15 from the mother.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is. And while most of these new mutations probably don't do anything significant, Cochran and Harpending say that if the average paternal age in a population is consistently high over many generations, it could lead to a buildup of slightly harmful mutations. They call this an increased genetic load.
So like a burden of slightly bad genes.
Exactly. And they point out that in many hunter-gatherer societies, the average paternal age tends to be lower than in other groups.
Okay.
They mention Australian Aboriginals as an interesting case because they historically had a higher average paternal age due to their social structures.
So their genetic load might be higher as a result.
That's what they're suggesting. And they even speculate that this could be contributing to some unexplained medical mysteries, like higher rates of infant mortality in certain populations.
Interesting. But they also say that natural selection could work against this effect, right? Like if men with a lower genetic load were more likely to have kids.
Exactly. So it's a complex interplay of factors. And then, shifting gears a bit, they also talk about the huge role that infectious diseases have played in human evolution.
Right, we touched on that earlier with malaria and smallpox.
Exactly. But they go deeper into how diseases haven't just driven the evolution of resistance, but they've also shaped our genetic diversity in other ways.
Okay, like how?
Well, they spend some time talking about the inflammatory response, which is a really important part of our immune system. It's basically our body's first line of defense against pathogens.
Right.
And they propose this interesting idea, this hypothesis that populations that have lived in tropical environments for a long time, where they're constantly exposed to tons of pathogens, they might have evolved to have a more easily triggered or upregulated inflammatory response.
So their immune systems are basically on high alert all the time.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the Duffy polymorphism, that mutation we talked about earlier that protects against malaria. It turns out that it also affects chemokine receptors, which are involved in the immune system and might even play a role in HIV susceptibility.
So one mutation, multiple effects.
Exactly. And they even suggest that these differences in inflammatory responses between populations could contribute to some of the health disparities we see today.
Wow. It's all connected.
It really is. And then they get into this really mind-bending idea that some genetic diseases, which seem harmful, might have actually evolved or persisted because they protect against other threats, like infections.
It was like a disease being beneficial in a way.
Exactly. It's that balancing selection or heterozygote advantage concept again. The classic example is sickle cell anemia and malaria.
Right, I've heard of that one.
But Cochran and Harpending suggest that this might be going on with other diseases too.
Really? Like what?
Well, they suggest that cystic fibrosis might offer some resistance to typhoid fever, and that maybe hemochromatosis, which is when your body absorbs too much iron, could protect against certain infections.
Huh. So the very thing that makes you sick might also be protecting you from something else.
Exactly. It's like this weird evolutionary balancing act.
Wow. And they even talk about chromosomal abnormalities, right?
Yeah, they even touch on the idea that the relatively high rate of chromosomal abnormalities and miscarriages in humans, that might be linked to infections in some way.
Wow. So much to think about there. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to touch on is their discussion of archaic human populations, like Neanderthals. They talk about the possibility of genetic contributions from those groups to modern humans.
Yeah, that's a fascinating area of research that has really taken off in recent years. Given that archaic humans like Neanderthals and early modern humans were around at the same time and they definitely interacted, it seems pretty likely that they interbred at some point.
And they weren't that different from us biologically, right?
Right. And even if it was relatively rare, those interbreeding events could have had big consequences if those archaic genes provided some kind of advantage.
Okay, so what kind of evidence do they present for this?
Well, they focus on this gene called microcephalin, or MCPH1, which plays a big role in brain development.
Microcephalin, MCPH1.
There's a specific version of this gene called haplogroup D that has some really unusual patterns. It seems to have spread crazy fast in human history, but it's also really different from other versions of the gene.
Okay, so that suggests it came from somewhere else.
Exactly. And the most likely explanation, according to Cochran and Harpending, is that this version of the gene came from an archaic population, maybe Neanderthals or Denisovans, about 37,000 years ago.
Wow. So we might have Neanderthal genes helping to shape our brains.
It's a real possibility. And they even mention another gene, the H2MAPT haplotype, as another potential example of Neanderthal introgression that could be affecting brain function.
So all of this, everything we've talked about, it really paints this picture of human evolution as something that's dynamic and ongoing and way more complex than we might have thought.
Absolutely. And for you, as someone who loves to dive deep and learn new things, what's really cool is how this perspective can completely change the way we think about ourselves.
Yeah, it's like a whole new lens to look through.
Exactly. And it raises so many questions, like how might understanding this recent evolution change how we approach health and disease?
Yeah, and even how we think about the differences between populations today.
Exactly. If our genes have changed this much in just the last 10,000 years, what might happen in the next 10,000?
And how much of what we see as cultural differences is actually rooted in these subtle genetic adaptations?
It's definitely food for thought.
It is. It makes you realize how much we still have to learn about ourselves and our history. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.